Gather round, friends. When that stray woman hit his porch, the wind was screaming like a gut-shot wolf. Now Colton, a 6'6" mountain, living completely alone for 5 long years, wanted neither company nor trouble up there. He pointed a massive leather-tough finger out toward the drafty barn, grunting, "You sleep there." He braced for weeping or begging, but her reply was so fiercely, shamelessly blunt that Giant actually felt his weather-beaten face flush hot with a rare blush. The bitter Wyoming territory did not give a damn if you lived or died. Colton liked that. Mid-November, and that high-country sky had looked like a bruised iron skillet since daybreak. Colton stood out in his homestead yard, swinging a heavy steel maul down hard on a thick round of lodgepole pine. Crack! The timber split clean through. He tossed those halves onto a woodpile that already towered clear over his own head. He paused, resting his weight on the maul handle. He took a deep pull of the frosty air. It tasted like tin and pure ice. A wicked blizzard was rolling in, the kind that buries cabins to the chimney and freezes cattle upright. He was gathering up an armful of split pine when he spotted it. A dark, jagged shape moving against the endless gray of that timberline. Colton dropped his firewood. He instinctively reached right for the Winchester rifle leaning against the solid chopping block. Starving bears get desperate come winter. But this shadow did not move like a bear. It staggered, pitched forward into a deep snowdrift, and just stayed down. Colton cursed under his breath. He didn't want this kind of trouble. He lived way up high where the air was thin and neighbors were strictly non-existent. He retreated up this mountain to be left completely alone, letting the lowland world tear itself apart while he sat quietly in the clouds. He trudged through the knee-deep powder. Getting closer, that rough shape finally turned into a person wearing a heavy wool coat absolutely caked in solid ice, a thick scarf wrapped tight around their face. No movement at all. Colton grabbed the heavy collar and rolled the poor soul over. It was a woman. Her lips were a deadly shade of blue frost clinging heavy to her eyelashes. Out cold, but her breathing was just a shallow, ragged, painful death rattle. A dead horse lay 50 yards down the snowy trail, already half buried. She had walked until her legs plain gave out. "Damn it!" Colton muttered into his beard. His deep voice sounded rusty. Hadn't used it much in years. He didn't dwell on it. Now you and I know he couldn't just let her die out there. He scooped her up. She weighed next to nothing, just freezing bones and soaking wet wool. He carried her across the snowy yard, booted his heavy oak cabin door wide open, and brought her in from the bitter cold. That single-room cabin smelled like chopped wood, old coffee, and cured meat. It was a strictly functional, no-nonsense kind of shelter. A cast-iron stove pumped out heat in the center next to a heavy oak table, and one corner bed buried under a thick pile of bear and elk hides. He sat her in the wooden chair nearest the blazing stove. She immediately slumped sideways. Colton caught her shoulders, keeping her upright. He unwound that frozen scarf from her face. I'll tell you, she was no fragile porcelain doll. Her skin was wind-chapped and brutally raw. She had a sharp jaw, a crooked nose that looked like it was broken and set poorly years ago, and dark hair plastered tight with melted snow. She looked like a gal who had been fighting her whole damn life and was currently losing. He grabbed a ragged towel and started rubbing her hands hard, trying to force warm blood back into those nearly frozen fingers. He didn't know the woman's name. Didn't rightly care either. He just needed her to knot up and die in his chair. After 10 minutes of brutal friction, she finally gasped. Her eyes snapped wide open. They were a pale, washed-out hazel. She flinched hard, pulling her hands back toward her chest like a wild, cornered animal kicking out blindly with her boots. "Hold still," Colton barked. His massive voice filled that small cabin. A deep, resonant rumble that literally vibrated right through the thick floorboards. She froze her wild eyes darting around the smoky room before finally locking onto him. She took in his sheer size. 6'6", broad across the shoulders, sporting a thick beard and hands the size of coal shovels. Most tough men took a nervous step back when they saw Colton. This woman just stared, shivering violently, her teeth clicking in a rapid, uncontrollable rhythm. "Horse died," she managed to whisper. Her voice was painfully raw, like she'd been swallowing desert sand. "I saw." Colton simply turned his broad back to her, stepping heavily over to the stove. He poured a steaming cup of black, sludgy cowboy coffee from the percolator into a battered tin mug. Walking back, he shoved it into her trembling hands. "Drink. It's hot." She gripped that mug, letting the searing heat bake into her frozen palms. She sipped, grimaced at the bitter bite, but swallowed it down. "I'm Cora," she said. Colton. He crossed his arms over his massive chest, looking down at her, silently calculating the sheer inconvenience. Outside, the wicked wind shrieked violently, rattling those thick window panes. The storm was hitting hard. She sure wasn't leaving today, nor tomorrow, maybe not for a whole week. A sharp, cold panic spiked right in Colton's chest, his quiet sanctuary ruined. "Let's tell it straight. I've got 3 mules to feed." Colton grunted, his tone flat and unwelcoming. "Wood to chop? I don't run a boarding house. Now listen here." Cora just stared at him over her tin mug. She didn't flinch at his bitter scowl. She was way too tired to care. "I ain't asking for satin sheets," she told him. "Just a dry corner away from that howling wind." Colton's jaw locked. He aimed a thick, rough finger right at that heavy timber door. "You sleep in the barn." Silence in that old cabin stretched thin. Colton watched her waiting for the usual fuss. He figured she would cry. He waited for those pleas for mercy, that fragile act meant to make a man feel like an absolute monster. And he was mighty ready to be one. He played the villain plenty down in the towns before quitting people entirely. Slowly, Cora lowered the tin cup to her lap. Her knuckles turned pure white, gripping that hot metal. She stared at the door, listening to bitter wind scream against those logs. Then she looked back at Colton. "The barn," she repeated, flat and deadpan. "Got fresh hay. It's dry. Mules throw off some heat." Colton just grunted. He turned away, grabbing a rag to wipe down the counter, trying to look mighty busy, ignoring that he was tossing a half-thawed woman into a freezing shed during a nasty Wyoming blizzard. "Mule heat," Cora muttered. "Right." She slammed the mug down with a sharp clack, stood up on wobbly, buckling legs, but she caught herself hard on the back of that chair. She didn't spare one glance at the door. She glared straight at Colton's broad back. "I sleep in the barn," Cora told him, her voice suddenly finding iron. "I'll be dead by morning. That wind strips the heat right out of the wood." "You'll survive," Colton muttered, refusing to turn. "No, I won't. And I refuse to die smelling of mule dung." She stepped toward him. "If I'm in that barn, you're sleeping in it too." Colton stopped wiping the old counter. He turned real slow, his heavy brow furrowed deep. "Excuse me?" Cora held her ground. Stood there dripping wet, shivering like a drowned rat, but those eyes of hers were entirely steady, cynical, and deeply pragmatic. "You heard me," she said. "If I'm out there, you are out there with me." A man your size throws off a furnace of body heat. It is pure survival. We pile hay, toss a tarp over us, and you strip down to your long johns. I'm going to press myself flush against your broad back, and you will keep me from freezing. Unless you're terrified of a half-dead woman touching you. Colton just stared. The dirty rag slipped from his fingers, hitting the floorboards. He opened his mouth, shut it, then opened it again. You and I know Colton was tough. 34 years old, wrestling steers to the dirt, shooting grizzlies at 20 paces. But the sheer, unabashed, shameless practicality of that woman's demand completely short-circuited his wild brain. She absolutely wasn't flirting. She wasn't trying to seduce a soul. She looked right at him the way a freezing drifter looks at a roaring fireplace. A pure resource. A sudden, terrifying heat started creeping up his neck. Then it hit his cheeks. Colton, giant of the ridge, terror of the valley, was blushing. He stammered, voice cracking. He cleared his throat, horrified by the sound. I ain't stripping down in no barn with you. Then I guess I'm staying in the cabin, Cora told him smoothly. She reached out, grabbed her metal mug, and sat right back down in that chair by the stove, leaned her tired head back, and closed her eyes. Good talk, Colton. The big man just stood there, paralyzed. Blood was pounding in his ears. He looked at her sitting there, claiming the space simply by refusing to yield an inch. He rubbed a massive hand over his weathered face, hiding that lingering flush. The man had been completely outmaneuvered. Fine, he grumbled, sounding like river rocks grinding together. You take the bed, I'll take the floor. Cora opened one eye. You sure I have no issue sharing body heat? Survival is survival. I'll take the floor. I take the floor! Colton barked louder than he meant. Cora smirked. Suit yourself, big man. Toss me a bear hide. My bones feel like ice. Colton stomped over, grabbed the thickest hide, and practically threw it at her. The man didn't utter another word. Retreating to the dark corner, he snatched up his whetstone and hunting knife, dropping hard onto a wooden stool. He started sharpening that blade with aggressive, hard, rhythmic strokes. He kept his eyes locked on the steel, but he heard her settling. He heard the heavy hide rustling as she wrapped it tight around her shoulders. We've all had days like this. He wanted peace, but got trapped in a 20-by-20 box with a gal holding more brass than a cavalry band. Outside, the winter storm slammed the mountain like a runaway freight train. The timber shuddered. Let me paint you a picture. The cabin went bone-chilling cold while that blizzard swallowed the frontier whole. Colton just sat there, honing his blade, his face flushing warm, wondering what kind of trouble he'd dragged inside. Morning never really showed up. Only a sickly gray light bled through those frosted panes. Come dawn, Colton woke on the floor, his spine groaning against the unforgiving pine boards. He had spent the night on a flimsy bedroll, surrendering the thick mattress and heavy winter pelts to Cora. That stove fire had died down to glowing coals, leaving the cabin air sharp enough to bite through bone. Every single breath plumed white in the gloom. He lay dead still, listening hard. The wind wasn't screaming anymore. Now it was just a low, endless roar. Drifts were stacked high against the heavy door. He didn't even have to look outside to know they were trapped. 3 feet, maybe 4. He cut his eyes over to the bed. Cora was buried deep under a mountain of pelts. Just a patch of dark hair poked out. She was breathing steady, still kicking. Colton grunted, hauling himself up. The man lived by absolute routine. Isolation was his religion, and hard chores were his daily prayers. He quietly stoked up the fire, feeding it dry kindling, until flames chewed eagerly at the wood. The iron stove ticked and popped as it swelled with fresh heat. He shuffled over to the tiny kitchen corner, pumping well water into the coffee pot, and scooping out bitter grinds. He carved off a thick hunk of salt pork, throwing it in a cast-iron pan. Sizzling fat and heavy salt cut right through the cabin's freezing, stale air. Smells better than it tastes, I hope. Colton didn't jump, but his broad shoulders went rigid. He shot a look over his shoulder. Cora was sitting up now, clutching a heavy bear hide tight around her. In that harsh morning light, she looked rougher than the day before. Pale, heavy shadows bruising her tired eyes. Her hair was a rat's nest, but those eyes were razor sharp. It's salt pork, Colton muttered flatly. Tastes exactly how it smells. Like salt. And pork. Cora swung her legs off the bed. She was still wearing the same muddy clothes from yesterday, though they had finally dried out. She scrubbed her face with both hands, letting out a low groan. Lord, my joints feel like coyote chew toys. You trekked 5 miles through a raging blizzard after your horse died, Colton said, turning back to the hot stove. You're just lucky you've got joints left to ache. Cora pushed herself up. She tested her shaky legs. They held firm. Pulling the thick hide tighter around her frame, she shuffled straight toward the glowing iron stove. She stood right by him, watching that greasy pork sizzle in the pan. She looked mighty small beside his shadow. Her head barely cleared his shoulder, but she didn't flinch away from his massive size like most folks normally did. She just locked eyes on the food. "Where I come from, a host usually asks how their guests slept," she pointed out dryly. "Where I come from, folks don't trespass in blizzards," Colton fired back, flipping the searing meat with an iron fork. "I'll be sure to schedule my near-death experiences more conveniently next time." Cora reached out, snatched a battered tin mug and held it up. Colton poured the steaming coffee. "You running from something?" It was a blunt, heavy question. "You and I know frontier etiquette. Don't pry." But Colton didn't give a damn about polite manners. He needed to know what brand of trouble was drinking his coffee. Cora blew on the dark brew, taking a slow sip. She didn't act offended. "I was a mail-order bride," she stated, her tone completely hollow of any romance or pity. "St. Louis, straight to Cheyenne. Turns out my new husband forgot to mention a gambling debt big enough to buy Missouri. Had a vicious temper to match." Colton kept his eyes glued to the skillet. "So you left?" "I left," Cora nodded. "Waited until he was blind drunk and passed out cold. Stole his horse. Figured I'd ride west, find a mining camp. Maybe scrub clothes or cook. Anything to stop being a punching bag for a fool owing the Pinkertons." She looked straight at Colton. "Then the damn horse died, and here I am completely wrecking your peaceful morning." Colton didn't say a single word. He plated that salty meat, shoving it toward her with a rock-hard biscuit. "Thanks," she muttered, dragging a wooden stool to the rough table. She ate like a machine. No polite, dainty bites here. She was strictly fueling up to survive. Colton sat right across the wood. He chewed his food in silence. Sure, he was used to quiet, but this felt entirely different. It wasn't that cold, empty mountain silence. It was a heavy, loaded kind of quiet. "You don't talk much," Cora observed, chewing on a dry biscuit. "Don't have much to say." "That why you live way up here? Terrified of conversation?" Colton just stopped chewing. He stared her down, those dark eyes narrowing into slits. "I like the quiet. People are loud. People are messy. They take and they lie and they ruin everything. Up here it's just hard rock and falling snow. These mountains never lie. If they kill you, they're dead honest about it." Cora swallowed hard. Now what do we make of that? She watched him a long time, studying his weathered face and the gray cutting through his beard. "Pull up a chair, friends." "That's a real pretty philosophy," she said softly. "But it's just a fancy way of hiding." Colton dropped his fork, clanging loud against that tin plate. "I ain't hiding from nothing." "Sure you are," Cora said, leaning in. She sure wasn't backing down. "You think you're tough just because you chop wood and outlast a blizzard. But you can't handle one little woman sitting in your kitchen without looking like a spooked colt ready to bolt. You're terrified of me, Colton." "I ain't terrified of a woman who weighs 100 pounds soaking wet," the big man growled. "Not my fists," she corrected, tapping her temple. "You're terrified I'll make you feel something. Annoyance, pity, or heaven forbid, real companionship." Colton stood up quick, his heavy chair scraping violently across those pine floorboards. He towered over her like a giant pine tree, his broad chest heaving. Cora didn't even flinch. She just took another calm bite of her biscuit. "Going to check on the mules," Colton grumbled, his voice a low, dangerous thunder. "You do that," Cora said without looking up. "Ask them how they slept." Colton just snatched his heavy winter coat right off the peg by the door. He shrugged it on, yanked his Stetson low over his eyes, and grabbed hold of that cold, iron door handle. He threw his whole massive shoulder against the wood, forcing it open against a heavy snowdrift. The vicious winter wind howled straight into that little cabin. Colton shoved his way out, into the blinding whiteout, slamming the heavy door shut behind him. He stood in that freezing gale, breathing hard. The woman was flat out insufferable, loud, cynical, and way too sharp for her own damn good. But for the first time in 5 long years, Colton wasn't lonely. That short trek to the barn took 30 brutal minutes. Picture this. 50 yards away, and he fought waist-deep drifts while the wind whipped ice crystals against his face like rock salt from a 12-gauge. By the time he battered his way back inside, his thick beard was a solid block of ice, and his lungs burned like a prairie fire. He stood in the entryway, kicking snow off his boots, just a mountain of a man shedding the brutal winter right onto the floorboards. But little Cora wasn't sitting idle by the stove. She'd found herself a crude broom made of bound pine needles, sweeping all the trail dust and stove ash right off those boards. She moved slow, still favoring those stiff joints of hers, but her sweeping had a relentless, steady rhythm. She had even scrubbed down their breakfast tin plates and set them up to dry. Colton shrugged off his heavy coat, hanging it by the fire to thaw out. He watched her a minute, the silence mighty thick except for that scratching broom. "Mules are fine," he grunted, breaking the quiet. "Angry, but alive. The hay is holding out." Cora never stopped sweeping. "Good, because if the grub runs low, I vote we eat the mean one first." Colton actually let out a short, rough breath. Wasn't exactly a laugh, but I reckon it was a mighty close cousin. "That'd be Barnaby. He's mostly gristle, you'd break your teeth." He lumbered over to the little wood pantry in the corner. He threw open those wooden doors, staring at the burlap sacks and tin cans. Out yonder, that blizzard wasn't breaking anytime soon. If anything, the deep ache in his weathered skull told him the real storm was just arriving. Time to stop pretending this was just some quick 2-day blowover. "Bring that slate board here," Colton ordered, pointing at a small chalk slate by the door he kept for tallying his trapping yields. Cora propped her broom against the wall, fetching the slate and a little nub of chalk. She stood right beside him, peering into the dim pantry. "We need a hard count." Colton muttered, his deep voice all frontier business. "I laid in grub for one man. A big eating man, sure, but just one. Now you're here. The whole math changes." "Write this down." Cora poised the chalk without a fuss. She understood frontier survival perfectly well. Colton started yanking supplies forward, calling them out, while the lady tallied. Cora finished writing, blowing chalk dust right off the slate. Her hazel eyes scanned the stark, cold truth of their situation. "It's the potatoes that worry me," she murmured. "Once they rot, we're stuck with just beans and salted pork. We'll be begging for scurvy come Christmas." "I got dried venison in the cold box outside," Colton added, pointing his thick thumb backward. "And those root cellars hold up better than you'd reckon." "But we don't eat till we're full anymore. We just eat till we ain't starving. Understood?" "Understood. Now listen to this part, folks." Cora set that slate down, her gaze traveling up his broad, heavy chest, right to his weathered face. "I ain't no freeloader, Colton. I know I'm eating through your winter stores. Come the spring thaw, I'll work it off. I can mend, cook, and balance a ledger." Colton just stared her down. "I don't need no ledger," he said, blunt-like. "I need the snow to quit." "Well, I can't fix the sky." Cora crossed her arms. "But I can surely fix that shirt you're wearing. You're missing 3 buttons, and the draft is blowing straight through those gaps." Colton peered down at his worn flannel. The lady had it right. He had been meaning to stitch those up for 6 months. "I can mend my own clothes," he grumbled, defensively as a cornered badger. "Clearly," she deadpanned, eyeing his frayed threads. "Sit down, take it off, and hand it over. You look like some grizzly that lost a nasty fight with a briar patch." For the second time since this woman blew in, Colton found himself completely unable to argue. He scowled, yanked the heavy flannel over his head, and surrendered it. He stood there in his thermal long johns, suddenly mighty aware of how tight that cabin felt, and how her eyes darted across the thick muscle of his shoulders before she turned her back to hunt down his sewing kit. The hard math of winter had shifted, and food wasn't the only thing Colton had to share now. By day 4, the blizzard settled into a terrible, blinding whiteout. The wind howled without end. It pounded the log walls, testing the chinking, hunting for weak spots. Inside that cabin felt downright tiny. Those timber walls felt like they were closing in, thick with the scent of wood smoke, damp wool, and the suffocating truth of two strangers breathing the exact same air. They worked out a quiet, careful dance to avoid bumping shoulders. Whenever Colton rose to stoke the iron stove, Cora moved toward the table. When she washed at the basin, Colton suddenly needed to check the frosted window seals. A restless dance driven by simmering, unspoken cabin fever. Picture this, folks. It was evening. The only light spilled from the open stove grate, throwing long, wild shadows across the rough floorboards. Colton rested on his wooden stool, a thick leather harness draped across his massive thighs. He was driving an awl right through the tough hide, stitching a busted strap with waxed canvas thread. That labor took brutal hand strength, his knuckles bone white. Cora sat on the bed edge, knees pulled to her chest under a heavy bear hide. She was staring hard at the flames. She hadn't spoken a word in 3 hours. Silence was Julian's best friend, but now it was grinding on his nerves. It felt dead wrong. He finally tied off a heavy knot, bit the leftover thread right off with his teeth, and tossed the rigged harness to the floorboards. He stood up, his stiff joints popping like firecrackers in the dead quiet room. He ambled over to a loose floorboard near the pantry. He pried it loose with his heavy boot heel, reached into the dark hole and fished out a mighty, dusty glass bottle. A quart of straight frontier rye, the cheap, fiery poison that scorches the throat and kills the pain. Colton yanked the cork with his teeth and spit it into his palm. He grabbed a pair of tin cups, splashed 2 fingers of that dark, amber liquid into both, and walked slowly over to the bed. He held one tin cup out to Cora. She blinked, finally tearing her glassy gaze away from the fire. She looked at the liquor, then back at him. "What's the occasion?" she asked, her voice rough as gravel from disuse. "Cabin fever," Colton stated flatly. "You're thinking way too loud. It's giving me a terrible headache." Cora offered a half smile, reached out and took the cup. Her cold fingers brushed his briefly. Colton felt that sudden spark of contact run up his arm, but he ignored it. He took his cup and sat in the heavy wooden chair opposite her. "To rotting potatoes," Cora toasted dryly, lifting her battered tin cup. "To surviving them," Colton replied. He threw his head back and swallowed the burning rye. It went down like liquid sandpaper hitting his gut, with a heavy, satisfying Western warmth. Cora took a much smaller sip. She didn't cough, though her eyes watered just a bit. "Smooth," she lied. "Tastes like iodine and bad decisions." "It does the job." They sat quiet for a spell, letting the liquor unspool those tight coils of muscle tension. Outside, the blizzard shrieked a lonely, desperate sound on the wild prairie. "Why Wyoming?" Cora asked out of nowhere. She rested her chin upon her knees, studying him over the rim of that tin cup. "You claimed you came up here because folks are loud and messy, but you don't strike me as a fellow who just got tired of hearing neighbors bicker. You look exactly like a man who got robbed." Colton stared into his empty cup. The cheap rye loosened his stubborn tongue just a fraction, but enough. "My brother," Colton finally said. "You and I both know some words taste like ash." He hadn't spoken them aloud in years. "Thomas?" Cora stayed perfectly quiet, letting him find his path through the bitter memory. "We ran a freight outfit down in Colorado." Colton continued, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly rumble. "Built it from dirt. Just 2 old wagons and 4 mighty mean mules. 10 years breaking our backs hauling silver ore down mountain passes that nobody else dared touch. We made money. Damn good money." Now Colton just paused, poured himself another finger of rye, and took it slow. Thomas craved easy money over honest sweat. He loved Denver's card tables and those charming fellas who kept a hidden hand right on their derringers. "He forged my signature, sold off the whole company. Wagons, freight contracts, mules, to a mining syndicate to cover his debts. Left me $100 and an apology letter." Cora's face turned to stone. No pity there. She offered pure anger, and Colton honestly preferred that. "So you didn't kill him?" she asked, dead serious. "I considered it. Colton admitted, meeting her gaze. Tracked him 3 weeks. Found him in a dusty Cheyenne saloon. He looked downright pathetic. Drunk, shaking, wearing a fancy suit worth more than our very first wagon. Killing him wouldn't buy back my 10 lost years. It'd just make me a killer. So I saddled my horse, rode high up into the timberline, and built this cabin. You chose the mountain over the hangman's noose, Cora whispered. Smart trade. It was peaceful up here, Colton muttered, scanning the tight room. Until you showed up. Cora took another pull of her whiskey. Like I said, my husband conveniently forgot his gambling debts. Seems we both have a knack for trusting the wrong men with the ledger. She swung off that bed, stepped to the stove, and splashed her remaining whiskey into Colton's empty tin. She stood close, the cast iron radiating intense heat between them. You were not hiding from the world, she told him, staring right down. Her pale hazel eyes looked mighty sharp and clear in that flickering firelight. You're hiding because you still care. If you truly didn't, you would have shot Thomas dead and left me out there to freeze in the snow. Colton just stared back. She was standing far too close. He caught the rye on her breath, tangled with raw wood smoke, and the faint natural musk of her skin. A sudden, violently terrifying urge hit him to pull her close and quiet that sharp, perceptive mouth. He stood up fast. The wooden chair groaned in protest. He towered over her broad chest, heaving heavily. Cora tilted her head back to hold his gaze, refusing to give an inch of ground. Go to sleep, Cora. Colton rasped his voice, thick and mighty rough. He didn't bother waiting for an answer. Turning his back, he walked to his floor pallet and lay in the dark. Whiskey burned his veins, but it couldn't quiet his restless mind. Now, disaster rarely announces itself with a loud crash. It started with a slow, agonizing groan. 3 a.m, on their 6th night. Stick with me. The wind had finally died, leaving a dead silence so heavy it felt like physical pressure on your eardrums. That howling blizzard had passed, dumping a massive, unprecedented load of snow onto the ridge. Colton woke instantly. His eyes snapped open in that pitch-black cabin. Creak. It sounded exactly like a wooden ship's hull groaning against the deep ocean, coming from right above them. Colton tossed his blanket and stood instantly. Cora, get up! His voice was a command. Across the dark room, rustling heavy bear hides meant she was moving. What is it? She mumbled, voice thick with sleep. The roof, Colton said. He struck a match and lit the table's kerosene lantern. Yellow light flared, casting wild shadows against those log walls. Snow's too heavy. The main ridgepole is bowing. He looked up at that massive, peeled pine log running the length of the ceiling. It supported the entire roof. The whole structure visibly sagged dead center. Splintering wood groaned as small flakes of pine dropped onto the floorboards, just like deadly snow. If that big ridgepole snapped, the roof would absolutely cave, bringing down tons of ice, snow, and heavy frontier timber right onto their heads. They'd be crushed instantly. Boots on now, Colton ordered. He didn't bother waiting for her to move. He sprinted over to the cabin's back corner where he stashed his spare lumber. He grabbed a thick, 8-foot section of raw timber he'd been saving up to build a front porch. It easily weighed over 100 pounds, but raw adrenaline made it feel like balsa wood in his hands. What do we do? Cora asked. She jumped out of bed, boots shoved on, eyes wide, staring at that sagging roof. You and I would be terrified. And another loud crack just echoed through the room. Thick dust rained down on them. We brace it, Colton grunted, hauling that heavy timber straight to the center of the room. I'm gonna lift this post right under the sag. When I get it completely vertical, you have to kick those heavy oak wedges under the base to lock it solid. You understand me? He pointed sharply at a pair of triangular wooden wedges sitting near the stove. Got it, Cora replied, grabbing those wedges fast. She dropped to her knees near the floor's center, right underneath the absolute most dangerous part of that cracking roof. She didn't hesitate, and she sure didn't panic. Get ready, Colton grunted. He stood that heavy timber straight up. Gather round, folks. He lined that heavy timber up right beneath the cracking roof beam. Planting his boots wide, he bent his knees and hugged that massive brace. "Wedges ready?" "Ready!" Cora hollered over the cabin's terrifying groans. Colton shut his eyes, drew a deep breath, and shoved hard. He poured every drop of his brute strength into it. Thick veins popped along his neck and corded forearms. With a wild roar, he drove that vertical post against the sagging roof. The dead weight was just unbelievable. He was fighting the whole freezing sky. Floorboards groaned beneath his boots. "Push, Colton," Cora screamed, gripping those wooden wedges. "Higher! Need an inch!" Colton straightened his aching legs, roaring in pure agony. That timber ground hard against the main beam, forcing the heavy roof up just a tiny, desperate fraction. "No!" he hollered out. Cora slammed that first wedge right under the timber's base. She grabbed a cast-iron skillet like a heavy hammer, driving that wedge deep with vicious, dead-center strikes. Clang, clang, clang. "Second one." Colton gasped out, his thick arms shaking violently under the crushing load. Cora scrambled to the other side. She shoved the second wedge in and hammered it home, locking that stout brace tight between the floorboards and the ceiling. "Clear!" she yelled out, rolling backward out of the way. Colton slowly, painfully let go of the wood and stepped back. The post held fast. The awful groaning stopped completely. That heavy brace was pinned tight, bearing the brutal weight of the winter snow. Colton dropped to his knees, chest heaving and sweating bullets despite the bitter cold. His tired arms just hung uselessly at his sides. Total silence rushed back, ringing in their ears. Cora sat near him on the floorboards, that heavy skillet still clutched tight in her hands. She was breathing hard, dark hair plastered to her forehead. She stared at the roof, then looked right at Colton. "You know," Cora panted, a breathless, shaky laugh slipping out. "Could have just chopped wood if you wanted to show off those muscles." Colton looked at her. He saw her shaking hands and the raw fire in her hazel eyes. She had crawled right under a falling roof just to save him. A sudden, dangerous shift happened in Colton's chest. The frozen walls he had spent 5 hard years building did not just crack, they absolutely shattered. He did not even think. He reached out, grabbed her heavy wool coat, and pulled her close. The skillet dropped and clattered loudly, but neither of them cared one bit. Colton pulled her tight against his chest, wrapping those massive arms right around her. He buried his face in her dusty hair. Cora gasped at the impact, but did not fight. For a second, she stayed totally rigid, completely shocked. Then, nice and slow, she let out a long breath. She wrapped her arms around his broad, sweaty shoulders, gripping his flannel shirt like a lifeline. They sat there on the freezing cabin floor, locked tight under that heavy timber brace, just holding on to each other in the dark. Now hear me well, folks. It was not for warmth or survival. For the first time ever, neither of them wanted to let go. But embraces end the way everything does out on the frontier, with cold, hard necessity. The stove had burned to ash, and the biting cold crept back in, sinking its icy teeth right into their sweat-dampened clothes. Colton pulled back first. No gentle smile, no lingering touch from this hardened man. He just cleared his rough throat in the dark and pushed up onto his knees. "Fire is dead," he grunted, refusing to meet her eyes. "I will fetch the kindling," Cora replied quietly. Her usual steady voice sounded mighty thin. She scrambled up to her feet, wiping a dust streak away with the back of a trembling hand. They stepped around each other in the gloom. Their old smooth rhythm was gone, replaced by an awkward, tense clumsiness. Colton fed heavy logs into the iron stove, while Cora stacked up the smaller, dry sticks. Their hands brushed once over the iron door. Colton yanked his back like he had grabbed a hot branding iron. Cora just pressed her lips tight and struck a match. Neither of them slept a wink that night. They sat in separate corners, staring at that heavy timber brace standing strong in the middle of the room. The roof held. You and I know frontier mornings well. Light did not just seep in, it exploded. The wind vanished. In its place, razor-sharp sunlight pierced the frosted glass. Colton stood up, joints popping, and walked to the oak door. He unlatched the heavy wood and pushed hard. Stuck fast. He planted a broad shoulder and drove his weight forward. The door groaned, moving just 2 inches. A solid white wall of packed snow stared back. Picture this. Snow drifted clear up to the eaves. "Hand me that flat-blade shovel," Colton grunted over his shoulder. Cora grabbed the iron spade from the corner, passing it over. No pointless questions. She just stepped back and watched him carve. It was mean, suffocating labor. Colton literally had to dig a tunnel out of his own front door. He chopped into the packed frost, tossing heavy blocks of ice back inside, onto a canvas tarp Cora had laid flat. When the pile got too big, Cora dragged that tarp near the stove. The heat melted the ice, and she swept the water out a crack beneath the rear window. 2 straight hours of muscle-tearing agony passed before he even breached the top layer. When Colton finally rammed the shovel through the crust and met that fierce, blue Wyoming sky, he let loose a long, ragged breath. He pulled himself up from the trench he carved, standing waist-deep in a blinding expanse of dead white across his yard. The whole world had shifted. Those jagged Teton peaks were smothered deep beneath a smooth, treacherous blanket of winter frost. Heavy pines bowed way low under the massive weight of snow, their limbs snapping with sharp cracks echoing like rifle shots across the valley. Cora scrambled up the trench behind him. She stood firm on the hard crust, blocking out the fierce glare. She looked tiny against that frozen wasteland, but her spine stayed rigid. "We gotta clear the roof," Colton rasped, chest heaving. He pointed a thick leather glove toward the cabin. "Sun will melt the top layer. Come dark, it freezes into solid ice, doubles the weight. Our brace won't hold that." "How in thunder do we get up there?" Cora asked, eyeing that slick pitch. "I get up there," Colton corrected her flatly. "I tie off to the stone chimney. You stay grounded. I push the snow, you take the wide shovel, and clear it from the foundation. If that wet pack stacks against the logs, it rots our wood by spring." He didn't wait around for her nod. He waded toward the shed for his heavy climbing rope. For 5 long hours, they ran on pure survival instinct. Colton scaled that deadly roof, boots sliding on glazed wood. He lashed a thick hemp rope right around his waist and choked it to the chimney. Taking a heavy wooden pushboard, he shoved huge shelves of snow free. Whoosh! Tons of powder smashed the dirt below. Down below, Cora fought those piles like a wildcat. She shoveled, hoisted, and hurled that snow away from the walls. Not one word about her screaming back. Not one single second to rest. Every time Colton glanced over, expecting her laid out in the snow, there she was. Jaw locked tight, stabbing her shovel into ice. Come late afternoon, the sun dropped behind the western ridge, staining the sky in deep, bruised purples and burnt oranges. The cold hit like a hammer. "That is enough!" Colton hollered down, voice raw. "Ice is forming. Head inside." He rappelled down the cabin wall, his arms heavy as lead. He cast off the rope and dragged his boots through the snow trench. Cora was already indoors. She had shucked off her soaked coat and knelt by the iron stove feeding it timber. Her hands were rubbed raw, shaking like a leaf. Colton secured the heavy door latch. He leaned on that timber, just watching her absolute, quiet strength. You and I both know grown men who would have tapped out 3 hours ago crying about the bitter cold, but Cora just dug. He walked to the basin, grabbed a rag, and poured warm kettle water. He brought it over. "Give me your hands," he commanded softly. Cora glanced up, hazel eyes thick with fatigue. She slowly offered her palms. The skin was torn up, bleeding slow where the wooden handle chewed her flesh. Colton took them in his massive, calloused paws. The big man was remarkably gentle, wiping the grime and dried blood with that damp cloth. He did not say a word, just cleaned the cuts, dark head bowed low. "I am not delicate, Colton," she whispered, searching his face. I know, he rumbled back in the dead, quiet room. He dug into his coat and produced a little tin of bear grease and beeswax used to heal saddle sores. He thumbed a generous scoop out of the tin, carefully working it deep into her busted palms. You are human, though, and leather cracks without oil. Cora did not pull away. She let him work that sharp, piney scent of medicinal grease settling heavy in the space between them. We beat the collapse, she said soft. We survived the snow. Colton countered, meeting her gaze, thumb resting on her wrist just a heartbeat too long. Let me tell you, winter was just waking up. Bodies are stubborn machines, but they keep a strict ledger. Let me tell you, Cora pushed herself past every human limit. She outlasted a frozen trail pioneer starvation rations, a caved-in roof, and back-breaking winter labor. But out here, the frontier always demands its payment. It hit on day 8. Colton sat by the fire, breaking down his Winchester rifle for oiling. A sudden clatter from the kitchen caught his ear. He glanced up. Cora had dropped her tin coffee cup. It rolled across the rough planks, spilling dark brew. She leaned hard against the counter, knuckles bone white on the edge. Cora? No answer. She just turned around slow as molasses. Her face burned a dull, feverish crimson. Those eyes of hers were completely glazed and staring through him. She took a single step, swayed like a chopped pine, and folded. Colton moved faster than a man of his massive size had any right to. He dropped that gun barrel and caught her before she hit the wood. The woman was absolutely burning. That blazing heat bled right through his thick flannel coat. She shook violently, teeth clattering in a rapid, terrifying rhythm of the sick. Damn it all, Colton growled, scooping her straight into his arms. He laid her on the mattress, piling heavy bear hides over her trembling frame. He recognized this curse. He had seen it lay waste to rugged mining camps and logging crews. Frontier lung fever. That bitter cold had settled deep in her chest, turning to heavy fluid and fire. 50 miles from a doctor, with passes choked by snow lung fever, was just a straight coin toss with the Grim Reaper. Colton got to work. He was no educated healer, but he understood the brutal mechanics of wilderness medicine. He stoked that cast-iron stove until it glowed cherry red. Dragging a heavy kettle onto the heat, he added fresh snowmelt and a thick handful of dried willow bark from his stash. Snatching up clean rags, he drenched them in an icy bucket near the door and rushed back to her bedside. He held an icy cloth to her blazing forehead. She flinched hard, letting out a low, terrible moan. Hush, now, keep still. Colton muttered, his gruff voice tight with a dark emotion he absolutely refused to name. Panic. For 2 brutal days, that timber cabin became a purgatory of boiling water, wet rags, and exhausting vigilance. Cora slipped in and out of a terrifying fever dream. She thrashed beneath the animal hides, kicking them away in hot fury, only to shiver uncontrollably seconds later, begging Colton to pile them back on. She babbled asleep. Not her usual sharp frontier grit, but broken, terrified little fragments. Don't, please, Dalton. The ledger is right. She whimpered weakly, burying her face deep into the pillow. I didn't take it. I swear. Colton sat anchored in the chair beside her, elbows on his knees, his massive hands locked tight. Dalton, the deadbeat husband, the ruthless gambler. He listened to this strong woman beg a phantom not to strike her. He heard her apologizing for sins she never committed. With every broken word, a cold, heavy fury pooled deep in Colton's gut. It wasn't that hot, flashy rage he once felt for his brother. This was something darker, something dense and metallic. He leaned in, taking her burning, thrashing hand inside his own. He squeezed it hard. You're safe, Colton rumbled, his deep voice, slicing right through the quiet crackle of the wood stove. Dalton ain't here. Ain't nobody here but me. Cora's eyes fluttered open. They looked cloudy, completely unseeing. She stared his way, chest heaving as she fought for breath. Colton, she whispered. Yeah, I'm right here. I just can't breathe. It's too heavy. She clutched at her shirt collar, her pale fingers weakly, trying to tear the fabric away from her throat. It's the fluid, he stated. You and I know the dread crawling up his spine. Gotta cough it out. Sit up. He slid his massive arm under her back, hauling her upright. She slumped against his broad chest, entirely boneless. She smelled of sour sweat and severe sickness. But Colton didn't care. He held her tight, wrapping his free arm securely around her ribs. Take a deep breath, Cora. Then cough. She tried. She drew a rattling, wet breath and launched into a coughing fit that sounded like ripping canvas. It racked her entire frame. She choked, gagged, and finally spat a thick, bloody wad of sickness right into the rag he held. She collapsed back into his arms, crying weakly from the sheer agony in her lungs. Good, that's good, Colton murmured, even though his own stomach turned. He rested his bearded chin lightly on her damp head, gently rocking her back and forth. You fight it, hear me? You didn't walk through a damn blizzard just to die in my bed. So bossy, she managed to wheeze out. A faint spark of her old pioneer cynicism slipping through the fever. Colton breathed a short, shaky sigh. Only when I gotta be. Drink this down. He grabbed the tin cup of dark willow bark tea. Now listen to me. It tasted like bitter dirt, but the medicine in that bark was the only thing standing between her and the grave. Pull up a chair, friend. He tipped the rim to her cracked lips, making her drink. She gagged, choking it down. He eased her back. He swapped the cold rag on her brow. Never slept a wink. Sat there, a sheer mountain of a man, holding back the dark. Come dawn on that third day, the cruel fever finally broke. Colton was nodding off in his chair, chin to his chest, when a faint rustle caught his ear. He jolted awake, hand flying straight to the hunting knife on his belt out of pure frontier instinct. Cora was sitting upright. She looked awful. Pale as flour, dark bruises under her eyes, hair plastered flat to her skull. But those eyes, clear as day, that glassy fever haze had vanished. She studied him. Then she eyed the water basin, bloody rags, and that empty willow bark tin. You smell downright awful, she rasped, her voice scratching like dead leaves. Colton just stared. The pure relief hit him so hard his vision actually blurred. He leaned back, dragging a heavy hand down his worn face. You ain't exactly blooming roses yourself, he grumbled, his voice thick with emotion. Cora managed a crooked smile. I owe you my life, Colton. You owe me nothing, he snapped, standing up. He turned away, messing with the stove, spooked by the raw gratitude shining in her eyes. You just owe me a tin cup. You dented mine dropping it. Cora watched his broad back, profound understanding filling her gaze. Put it on my tab. 3 weeks later, the frozen world began to weep. A Chinook wind howled over the western ridge. A strange, unseasonal warmth came sweeping right down through that mountain valley. Jumped 40 degrees in one afternoon. Huge snowdrifts collapsed, melting into muddy, rushing torrents that carved deep trenches across the yard. The steady dripping from the eaves sounded like a ticking clock. Cora was up again, moving with careful, deliberate slowness. That lung fever had downright torched the very last of her reserves. She looked thin cheekbones sharp as flint, but that stubborn frontier fire was back in her eyes. We're out of salt pork, Cora announced, standing by the open pantry with a slate and some chalk. Got half a sack of beans left and maybe 1 pound of flour. Nothing but venison jerky, and that's running low. Colton sat by the window, oiling his boots. Now, friend, look out at that muddy yard with me. The thaw was a blessing and a curse. Isolation was ending fast. The pass down to Blackwood Gorge ought to be clear enough now, Colton said, his voice dead flat. I'll take the mules down tomorrow. The trading post will have our supplies. Cora turned, clutching that slate tight against her chest. You're heading down the mountain. We gotta eat, Colton muttered, looking away. Got a dozen prime pelts I cured before the snows hit. I'll trade them for flour, bacon, coffee, maybe canned goods. Cora hesitated. I could ride with you. Colton stopped wiping that boot. He looked up, dark eyes locking right onto hers. No, you're too weak. It's a rough trail. You'd just slow me down. A flat-out lie. He didn't want her spotted. Cora set her jaw tight. I ain't a prisoner, Colton. No, you're a runaway wife with a gambling husband owing money to dangerous outlaws. Colton stated it brutally, cutting right through any polite pleasantries. Men who might be hunting you at the mountain's base. Stay put. Lock the door. Keep that shotgun loaded. He didn't give her room to argue. Stood up, snatched his heavy coat, and marched outside to check the mule harnesses. Come dawn, Colton loaded up Barnaby and the other mules with those heavy bundles of cured winter pelts. Cora stood on the porch, bundled in her thick coat. The crisp air smelled of wet pine and raw earth. Colton swung into his saddle, eyeing her. Back in 2 days, he said. Don't burn the cabin down. Don't buy cheap coffee, she fired back. Nodding sharply, he spurred his horse, leading the mules down that muddy, treacherous frontier trail. That ride down to Blackwood Gorge took 8 grueling hours. Picture this with me. A sprawling, rough-hewn timber trading post at the mountain's base, packed with rugged miners and trappers, smelling of raw tobacco, stale beer, and unwashed men. Colton tied his animals to the weathered hitching post. He hauled those heavy bundles of pelts inside, dumping them hard onto the long wooden counter. Cyrus, the balding owner, raised a brow. Colton, figured the winter finally took you. Ain't seen your face since September. Takes more than snow to bury me. Colton grunted. Need provisions. Picture this. Flour, bacon, coffee, sugar. Then he paused, a sudden heat flushing his thick neck. Got any canned peaches? Cyrus chuckled, scribbling in his ledger. Peaches. A big mountain man like you getting a sweet tooth. Colton just offered a stone-cold glare until the storekeeper's laughter died. Just pack the supplies. While Cyrus weighed the dry goods, Colton drifted toward the potbelly stove in the center of the room, thawing his frozen hands. 3 other fellas shared that room. 2 were local gold miners, completely drowning in their cups, but that third man stood out. Wore a heavy riding duster covering a fine tailored wool suit. Sported a bowler hat pushed back on his crown, and a polished Colt revolver riding high on his hip. Didn't look like no rugged frontiersman. He reeked of big city money and cold city violence. That sharp-dressed stranger was talking to a miner, flashing a small scrap of paper around, like I said. The bowler hat drawled, his slick voice cutting right across the dusty room. She stands about 5'3", dark hair, hazel eyes, maybe calling herself Cora. $100 for information leading to her capture. $500 if she comes back breathing. Colton stopped dead. Blood roared loud in his ears, completely drowning out the crackling stove fire. $100. The miner whistled, words slurring thick. What did she do? Kill somebody? Or rob her own husband? Stole a mighty significant chunk of cash, the man purred, tucking that paper away. Her husband is plenty eager to fetch her home. Now you and I know trouble when we see it. Colton turned slow. This fellow was no official Pinkerton detective. He was hired muscle, just a ruthless thug wrapped in expensive wool. You boys seen any woman matching that description? The slick stranger asked, sweeping his gaze across the whole room, before locking onto giant Colton. He sized up Colton's towering frame, the wild beard, and the heavy hunting knife resting on his belt. The stranger's hand casually drifted near his Colt. How about you, big fella? The man asked, a mocking little smirk playing on his lips. You look fresh from the high country. See any pretty desperate women wandering the deep snow? Beneath his coat, every muscle in Colton's massive body coiled completely tight. The sudden urge to cross those floorboards, grab those fancy lapels, and toss him right through the glass window was nearly overpowering. It would be downright easy, just a fast, brutal, satisfying violence. But starting a saloon brawl meant dealing with the local law. Worse, it would paint a giant red arrow straight back up that snowy mountain to Cora. Colton met the stranger's gaze with dead, flat eyes. I live at 10,000 feet. He rumbled, his deep, gravelly voice literally shaking the wooden floorboards. The only things I see up there are hungry bears and dead men. Neither of them pay very much. He boldly turned his back on the gunman, ignoring the icy prickle of danger sliding down his spine, and stepped to the counter. Cyrus finally finished bagging up the camp supplies. "Put it on the mules," Colton ordered abruptly. He slapped a heavy silver dollar on the wood for those sweet peaches, and never waited for his change. He stormed right out the swinging doors, the thick mud sucking hard at his boots. He loaded up the mules with frantic, terrifying efficiency. Didn't even bother checking the leather girths. He just vaulted straight into the saddle, snatched the thick lead rope, and spurred his horse hard up the steep trail. He pushed those sturdy animals to the absolute brink of exhaustion, driving them up the slick, dangerous incline as the mountain sun began dropping fast. That high mountain isolation hadn't protected him one bit. It only delayed the inevitable reckoning. The outside world was roaring loud. It was messy, and it was climbing the ridge for the only precious thing he had finally decided he wanted to keep forever. Colton rode hard into the gathering darkness, his heavy jaw set like solid granite. He sure wasn't running this time. If Dalton's bounty hunters reached that peak, they wouldn't find some frightened runaway wife. Instead, they'd find a mountain giant holding a lever-action rifle and a very deep, very cold, open grave. Colton originally climbed that peak to hide from the cruel world. Now he's riding back up, ready to wage a bloody war against it. That winter blizzard might have thawed, but the true storm is just brewing. Will those hired Western guns locate the hidden cabin? Can Colton and Cora's fragile frontier romance survive the brutal, ugly reality of her past finally coming to collect? Now, if you and I are on the same page, and this gritty tale of frontier survival hooked you, hit that like button and share this video. Subscribe to the Storyteller channel and ring the bell so you don't miss our epic showdown. I'll see you farther up the dusty trail.